The French presidential election. I could tell you about the intricacies of the French electoral system, which requires patronages, 2 voting rounds, and unfolds over the course of 2 weeks. I could tell you about the program of the 12 different candidates, some of which are projected to win a grand total of 0.3% of the vote. I could also complain about the absence of a debate ahead of the presidential elections, or I could make a summary of Macron's 5 years in power, his image as a president of the rich, or his king-like style of governance.
C'est de l'arrogance. On a un président qui ne supporte pas la moindre contestation.
Or I could talk about his attempts at reforming France, whose debt increases year on year, whose retirement age is one of the lowest in Europe, and where inequality is on the rise. I could tell you about Macron's plans for Europe, or I could tell you about the rise and fall of far-right pundit Éric Zemmour, but that would take me too long. So instead, what I'll do is I'll focus on 4 themes that played out over the past 5 years that are shaping how France sees itself in Europe and in the world. The 17th of November 2018. An online petition reaches 1 million signatures to go out and protest in the streets of France. The catalyst? An additional tax on petrol at tank stations to pay for the energy transition. Those most affected are part of the lowest income brackets who live in sprawling suburbs and are dependent on cars.
There are those who say that his policies are hurting some of the most vulnerable in society.
But it's more than just about a tax. It's about growing inequality and the sentiment of out-of-touch elites. The result? Months of protests that will only dissipate after a charm offensive by Macron and a series of grand debates. Later legislation, whether it be pension or labor market reform, would see flare-ups of gilets jaunes-like protests, which would derail much of Macron's reform agenda. But while the political agenda was derailed, France continued forward. 8 years after a humiliating strike by the French football team at the World Cup in South Africa, France won the World Cup for the second time.
Are the champions of the
This victory embodied the idea of a France that looks forward, with the planned organization of the Olympic Games and the Universal Exhibition, pushing forward the idea of la France qui rayonne, that whether it be culturally, scientifically, or diplomatically, France enlightens the world. But France is also this.
3 people have been killed in a knife attack in the French city of Nice.
Une policière municipale a été attaquée ce matin au couteau.
Beheaded outside of his school after showing his class cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad.
Symptom of the malaise of France's large immigrant-descended population, neglected ghettos of the banlieue, and a rejection of French identity by a youth that has no opportunity.
Il y a une crise de l'islam partout qui est gangrénée par ses formes radicales, par ses tentations radicales. Ce à quoi nous devons nous attaquer, c'est le séparatisme islamiste. C'est un projet conscient, théorisé, politico-religieux, qui se concrétise par des écarts répétés avec les valeurs de la
The
République.
response to terrorism has been an attempt to Frenchify Islam, a crackdown on radicalized mosques, harder positions on immigration, and a reinforcement of the security apparatus. And for the French, it has meant a turn to conspiratorial thinking.
Le grand remplacement.
C'est le grand remplacement.
Le grand remplacement touche toute la France.
The Great Replacement, a conspiracy theory which considers that indigenous Europeans are being replaced, worries 2/3 of the French, according to one poll. It's pushing some to rally the political extremes, with 30% of the French planning on voting for a far-right candidate in the first round of the election. But while France struggles with its economy and questions of identity, it's also struggling to find a role internationally. Left humiliated by a submarine deal between the US, UK, and Australia,
C'est vraiment en bon français un coup dans le dos.
or its ailing anti-Islamist operation and presence in Africa, and partially sidelined by its attempts at mediation in Ukraine, France's area of action has shrunk, and it no longer has the capacity to act in the world on its own. Between the European COVID recovery package or the European reaction to the Ukrainian crisis, the country is increasingly forced to rely on Europe as the solution to its problems, both financially and internationally. And so what do the French think about Europe? When France first hung up the EU flag under the Arc de Triomphe, it faced backlash by nationalists and populists.
Rivals of President Emmanuel Macron called the move an affront to France's heritage.
2 months later, in the context of the war in Ukraine, the opposition to it had been muted. But despite this, France remains one of the most Eurosceptic countries in Europe. And while no candidate wants to leave the European Union, some have promised to dismantle it from within.
Welcome at the Bali. Vous êtes les bienvenus. Tonight we look back on 5 years of the French President Emmanuel Macron, and we look ahead to the French presidential elections in April. What are the most important themes for the French? And have the cards been shuffled since the Russian invasion of Ukraine? We will look into these topics from different perspectives. We have French speakers living in the Netherlands and European speakers living in France. And we have a live cartoonist. Although we all have a paper and a pen, there's just one here who's going to draw the cartoons. And this program is a collaboration with the European Council of Foreign Relations. But before we start, I'm very curious who we have in the audience. Who of you is French? Who has a French background? Okay, quite a lot. And who can vote during the elections? Okay, can we go to the person with the black sweater because, yes. And do you already know for who you're going to vote? You think so, yes?
Yeah, I think so.
And do you want to share it with us?
I think I will vote Macron. Normally I vote more left, but I think this is it's good to make also a counter vote for extreme parties.
Okay, so you're voting strategically, not with your head, but with your head, not with your heart.
Yeah, last time for the second round I voted Macron also, so it's my my second choice, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. And then the person there with the grey sweater.
Yes, I'm not so sure yet. I have similar sympathies. My friends are trying to convince me to vote Mélenchon, which is because I'm normally very left, but I'm not convinced by Mélenchon himself. It's very frustrating if you're left wing and have to vote in France at the moment.
You don't have enough to choose.
Well, so you're not gonna So I would like Yannick Jadot, but he's never gonna make the second round. So it's basically throwing your vote in the away. Some of my friends say maybe if we get enough people to vote Mélenchon, he gets to the second round, or indeed, just Macron and hoping that you don't have a second round with Pécresse and Le Pen or. Yeah, such a situation.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Before we go into our panel talks, I want to introduce our cartoonists, Eliane Gerrits, or actually she preferred to be called Eliane Gerrits in the atmosphere of this evening. Welcome, Eliane. You can take the mic. Sorry, your last name?
My last name is Dutch.
Oh, sorry, I should say Gerrits.
My first name that's French.
Eliane Gerrits, welcome. And we know you from for your political cartoons in Elsevier, the Huffington Post, and also before in NRC Handelsblad. And we also have a slide actually from the 12 candidates, which you draw for us tonight. Yes, we see, the 5 most popular, I would say, above. And did you draw French politicians the last 2 months a lot or not?
No, not so much, because at Elsevier I'm asked to do only Dutch politics. But sometimes it's got, I do foreign policy from a Dutch angle. So I did one drawing about that was at New Year's. And I did a drawing about 2022, and I had Zemmour in the drawing.
Okay, and where will you be focusing on tonight? What can we expect from you?
I don't know yet myself. I'll just think of things as we go along, I think. I just started something about Macron's lead that is narrowing.
Okay, I'm very curious, and we'll be checking into you now and then.
Okay.
Let me introduce my first guests. On the left, Hugo Bezombe, a French storyteller and an engineer. And he has been working and living in the Netherlands for almost 5 years. And you have 7 years. And you have a media platform, Into Europe, on which you share videos, animated videos, like the one we saw during the introduction. Good to have you here. And on my right, Laurent Chambon, a sociologist and a political scientist focusing on minorities in the Netherlands and in France. And among other things, you wrote a book on Marine Le Pen. Enchanté, welcome, very good to have you here. Hugo, to start with you. On your platform, Into Europe, you inform subscribers about foreign policy, politics, geopolitics. Is the French presidential election a hot topic?
I think the French presidential election kind of fell into the background also in France, so there hasn't been that much interest for it up until now, mostly because of the situation in Ukraine, but also because there has been, like I mentioned in the video, an absence of a debate ahead of it, so there hasn't been any attention for it so far.
Should there be more?
I think that in the coming 10 days, the things will start to heat up. We were talking just over dinner about some of the scandals that have recently been erupting around the campaign. So I think there will be more attention.
Okay. And during the start of the video, you said I could choose some thematic topics to talk about, but I chose to talk about how France sees itself in Europe and the world. Why did you choose this angle?
Because I think that if I had covered all the topics that are related to the French election, it would have been a 1.5-hour documentary and we wouldn't have time for the panel discussions. But because I think it's more important for people to understand what's at stake, what's at play, and making a list of politicians, I think, wouldn't have contributed a lot to the evening and to informing people of some of the difficulties that France as a country is facing and that French society has to solve or deal with in the coming 5-10 years.
Mm-hmm. And do you think international media covered it enough?
Oof, that's a good question. I tried to include some of the international media within the context of the French campaign, but I think there is, on some level, a lack of understanding by international media of what's going on in France. So what do the Gilets jaunes really mean? What are concepts like laïcité, secularism, but then with a very French flavor to it? These concepts are not properly understood or addressed within the international media.
Okay. And Laurent, you saw the video. Do you recognize the image of France in the video?
Yes. Sometimes, I left France long ago, almost 25 years. The country I left is so not the country that you see now in the media or in the news. So it's quite difficult. And
what do you mean? Like, how has it... Like, if you name 1 or 2 things, what has been...
When I left, we were 60 million with 70 millions.
Okay, yes,
When I left, my parents were in the banlieue, almost in the countryside. Now they didn't move, and there are towers around them. And there's the new metro coming, and everything is modern and cool. At the same time, it's full of people. We talk about grand remplacement, but when you go in Paris, you have really all the faces in the world, which you don't see too much actually in Amsterdam if you compare. So it's kind of a shock if you come back from Holland again. And the food hasn't really improved actually. It was a big shock.
Also important,
I was thinking,
yes.
In 25 years, but maybe it's coming. I don't know. Yeah, and when you come from Holland, you realize that French people are still very attached to some traditions. They think of themselves as modern, but the same as Dutch people actually also like traditions. But it's always and what's for me really disturbing is young people talk like young people and have no clue what they're saying. It's really, really embarrassing.
What do you mean?
Like, for example, instead of père, the father, now they say daron. Now, I almost had to look in the dictionary because I was like, what?
That's 10 years ago already.
No, that's how, it's really embarrassing, yeah.
Okay, back to politics.
Yeah, sorry.
How do you look back at 5 years of Macron?
Alors, I'm going to be honest, I'm left-wing, okay? So I'm not really a fan in the first place. And from what I see, from the people I know, from what I read, is really destroying education, the hospital, all the common things. So, of course, ultra-liberal people will find that it's liberation, but I see it really as a work of destruction. And I hear from everywhere that there's way more poverty than there was, there's way more inequality than there was, and everything, but it's a bit the same in Holland, everything is also becoming more expensive. So the life of French people has not improved the last 5 years.
So, like, what has become of his promises then? Because
none. Yeah. He said equality between men and women. We're still waiting, I think. He said, I'm going to fight racism. We're still waiting. Yeah. He said we're going to have no one who lives on the street. There's never been so many people living on the street. He says, I'm going to fix school. He's been destroying it. Everything he says that he would do, he hasn't done. Actually, he has done the opposite. It's okay, I understand that it's not always easy, and between what you promise and what you will do, there's a discrepancy. But in that case, it's really, really extreme.
Harsh words, destruction of a hospital, educational system. Would you agree?
So I think I can also be clear a bit more on my political leanings. I think I'm more center-right in general. Yeah, but I see that some of the reforms have indeed been damaging to some elements of French society, but at the same time, you have to take into account the economic realities of a country whose debt is growing year on year. At the start of the video, I showed a graph. The debt of the French government is 120%.
So you say the reforms had to be taken?
Well, I'm saying some of them didn't even go far enough, or some just didn't happen in general. So I agree with you in that sense that some stuff didn't happen, especially the pension reform. But that the government hasn't necessarily been trying to put them in place in the best way. So there has been very little consultation of French society to put them in place. It has been very top down in terms of the implementation of reforms. But at the same time, some reductions in social spendings are necessary.
And what about, like, I asked you at the beginning the importance of the media coverage of the French elections, and do you think that there's enough interest in France itself for these elections?
I find it very hard to judge because I've been living here for 7 years. I definitely find it interesting. I read articles on the news all the time, but maybe some people in the audience know better than I do for this.
Yeah, because I read this article, and then they said that the French leading TV channel, which normally always devotes like an entire evening to the first round results of the presidential vote, they won't do this time, but they will show a clownish cult comedy. And then I was like, okay, if we even have to capture the imagination of the French voters, what do you expect, like, from tonight? Like, how can we make this, or should we make this important?
I have no idea. I wish French people were more interested in politics.
You have to say for Dutch people that most of the French newspaper and the TV channels are owned by billionaires who are either right-wing, either almost fascist. And in their view, it should be either Macron, either Le Pen. So it's better not to talk about it, and hopefully it will go again like 5 years ago. And they definitely would not like to have another scenario. And TF1 is definitely the private channel. So I'm so not surprised they're doing this, actually.
And I think it's nice with this to sort of come back at something that you mentioned in your introduction. You asked if the invasion in Ukraine had sort of reshuffled the cards of the presidential election. I think in some ways it has stacked them more in one direction. So it sort of reinforced the status quo because it sort of took away from the debate of the French elections, and it sort of made sure that continuity was desirable in uncertain times. It's the rally the flag effect.
Yeah.
So I think that's also what we're seeing ahead of the presidential elections.
Yeah, the rally around the flag effect, like when there's a crisis that a lot of people...
Everybody rallies around the leader.
Around one person in this case.
And it's also like been politicized a lot. So Macron has been showing himself around with Putin and saying, look at me, I'm negotiating, I'm in charge. And that's something that his political opponents just can't do.
Well, it was more embarrassing than anything, actually. Huh? Every time he talked to Putin, and it was being played by Putin, we've seen every time. I think it was more embarrassing than anything else.
But the perception of the French has been positive for it.
Really?
I read this poll that said 65% of people were approving of Macron.
Okay.
Because he wanted to play like a role of de-escalation,
yes,
but that maybe didn't really work out.
But the French have been responsive to it because that's the whole idea of le rayonnement that I showcased in the video. French people want to be shining on the international sphere, and Macron is giving them that.
Yes. What makes the French presidential elections important for our audience tonight? Why should we talk about it?
There are
for 1.5 hours.
First is, it sounds weird to say that, but France is kind of a mirror of Holland. Because most of the things we have in Holland, we have in France, or the one we have in France, it's just a bit different. So it's kind of a magic mirror that you see yourself, but differently, with more cheese, or I don't know how you present it, but funky, but still the same, actually.
But what do you mean, like the results?
We have the same here. There are also 3 right-wing, extreme right-wing political parties that are racist. One is fascist, actually, like Zemmour also. We have a prime minister that stays forever, like Macron seems is going to stay also forever, with the same politics, neoliberal. We have the left wing that is really catastrophic. I'm actually surprised they're still breathing. And we have a center that doesn't know exactly like CDA and the Républicains. It's the same. They're trying to go along with the winner, but they would like to be different. It's very similar. So it's for this, it's kind of a magic mirror of Holland. The second thing is whether you like France or not is not going to go away because it stays there. And there's 2 giants in Europe. It's mostly Germany and France. And whether you're interested or not, what happens in this country will have a huge impact on the European Union and the world. Whether it's positive or negative, it can be a paralyzing impact, or it could drive Europe in a way or another. So we know that whatever happens in this French election will have definitely consequences for all Europeans.
Yes, and France is the second largest Western European country, and it has the second largest economy in Europe. So in that sense, I want to make it important. So it has an influence on us. About the other things, yes, the influence of the left. We're also going to talk about it later. Can we see the cartoon on the big screen to see what's going on with Eliane, if it's possible? Oh yes.
Maybe someone should explain. You want to explain?
Maybe a little bit of context. There's an ongoing scandal right now in French politics where apparently the French government has spent additional sums of money on consultancy.
More than 1 billion. Yeah, okay.
Not only McKinsey. I think it's important to mention. Yeah. BCG and the rest also got their share, probably. And this has sort of been at the detriment of France's grande école establishment, I think.
Now, we have also one problem is it's not completely proved yet, but it looks like Macron got financed by McKinsey for his campaign and has been paying back McKinsey with bullshit stories, like paying lots of money for a PowerPoint of 3 slides. And what's interesting also besides this, it tells a lot about France because France has a tradition of high civil servant. That are many of them really, really good. Not everyone, but some are very, very good.
It's also a very elitist institution.
And they know the country. And it looks like he needs to ask American cabinet for expert because he doesn't know what's going on in the country. That's really embarrassing. And besides that is the policy of the government. It looks now, it's based on the 3 slides from McKinsey instead of the recommendation.
But this still has to be proven, or is this for sure?
Is proven, yeah. Okay. When it comes to education, is really embarrassing. So it's incompetent people who are overly paid to do report, and it has a direct impact on politics and on the consequences for the French people. It's really, really embarrassing. And it's not because he's Macron and he's right-wing, it's really, really embarrassing. Yeah.
You are going to switch places with other speakers, but where do you hope for tonight? What are your expectations?
I hope people learn more about France.
And which topic do you hope we will discuss here?
Now, there's one topic that I actually wish that I could have included in the video and also in this conversation, and that's the one of the energy transition, which is notoriously absent from the French political debates at the moment. But
okay, let's see if we can
find it
capture the energy transition. Thank you, Hugo. And yes. And I want to welcome Susie Dennison here and Peter Giesen. Welcome. We can have an applause again for you. Yes, Peter Giesen, welcome. Europe editor for the Dutch newspaper Volkskrant and a former correspondent in France. And you wrote a book about that period, Retour de France, nominated for the Brass Prize for the best book, for the best journalism book. Welcome. And Susie Dennison, member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, a pan-European think tank, and you're specialized in migration and European foreign policy and Europe in the world. Welcome. How do you listen to the conversation so far?
I thought it was fascinating. There were obviously a couple of points where I differed from the speakers, but for me, I found it a really good way into understanding the debate in France at the moment. I've lived there for 7 years in France, but this is the first election that I've got a stake in because I've just got my French nationality, so I'm allowed to vote.
You can vote.
I found it very helpful.
And on which point did you differ from the other speakers?
Well, I think the key thing for me that sort of struck a discord, I guess, was the idea that French people don't care about politics. For me, sort of thinking back about Macron's first mandate and the things he's disappointed on, one of the big issues is the extent to which he promised a new kind of politics. He promised to sort of push the old system aside and do things differently, build from the grassroots up and take people along with him. And my sense is that the deep discontent that you can really feel in France at the moment with the fact that we probably are facing another 5 years of the same government is sort of precisely comes from that place that they feel that the system isn't delivering anymore. So they care about politics, but they don't think it's worth going out to vote. And I think that's one of the really big risks around this election is abstention levels.
Would you agree, Peter?
Yes, but 10 years ago they said that Sarkozy didn't deliver. 5 years ago they said that Hollande didn't deliver. Now it's Macron. And it's true that he didn't fulfill his promises. Actually, I'm more liberal than Laurent. And I thought 5 years ago that actually Macron, for all his faults, he could be kind of like a fresh wind blowing through France. Because in Netherlands, I think, liberalization, flexibilization, etc., has gone much too far. But I thought that France was a really very rigid country in which people were really clinging to their privileges, which made culture very, very defensive and very bit frightened. And I thought that France could do with a bit of liberalism.
And you lived there for a long time. What fascinates you about the country?
About France? Yes. Well, that's actually something completely different. But what I really liked was, the respect and the knowledge of culture and history.
Culture history. Okay.
Yeah, and that's. I thought that was much better than in the Netherlands.
And Susie, how did you feel about Macron winning the elections 5 years ago?
I felt it was an exciting moment. As I say, I completely agree with Peter's characterization of it being a sort of a fresh wind that was blowing. It was a young president, and it felt like a positive moment. And I think that was something which resonated across in the European context too. I think that a lot of other countries were looking across sort of of with envy at the beginning. And, you know, I have to say, and I guess we'll come on to this, that when you look at the role that Macron has played within the European project, there I can see more positive signals. But yes, I think that he hasn't been dealt a very easy set of cards in terms of having to be the president through COVID, in terms of now what he's dealing with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and so on. You know, none of these things have been straightforward. But at the same time, I think it's really sort of in the domestic context that that disappointment has set in.
Yeah, you already mentioned it. Like Macron held the torch for European sovereignty. Did he succeed?
Well, this is an interesting question. So at TCFR, we've commissioned some polling across the EU, which was in the field in January and February this year, so just ahead of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what was quite striking there was that when we asked questions about how people felt about the idea of sovereignty, the most negative country was France. Which, when you look at the sort of the political energy which Macron has put into that, I think shows probably two things. Firstly, that he's got a lot more work to do domestically to sell the sort of the value of Europe to French people. Clearly, that message hasn't penetrated. But I think, secondly, it shows us that it's unlikely, you know, even if he does, as everybody expects, win a second mandate, it's unlikely that that's going to be a mandate to sort of really invest at the same level in Europe as he has been over the last 5 years. That doesn't seem to be what French people want.
Yeah, we have a slide of called the French paradox, least positive about European sovereignty. Maybe we can see the slide.
Yeah, and as you can see here, we basically asked the question about whether or not, when they heard the word European sovereignty, people had a positive or negative reaction. And I should say that for a lot of people, they didn't have any reaction. This isn't really a sort of a concept that normal people sit at home and think about. But as you can see there, for most countries, apart from Italy, Greece and France, they were more likely to have a positive reaction than a negative one. But yeah,
Estonia, Poland, Hungary in the top. That's also quite interesting.
And I think that that is very sort of representative of the moment that we're living in. The countries sort of at the top of that picture are those that feel the threat from Russia the most strongly. And they're thinking about sovereignty very much in a security sense. But of course, the sovereignty that Macron has tried to sell in Europe is a much sort of broader idea about our ability to engage across the different files, from economy to health to climate and so on, and defend our interests in a hyper-connected world.
And Peter, how do you look at Macron's role in the European project?
Well, I think it's quite interesting because it was one of my last stories as a correspondent in 2018. I came to the conclusion that Macron had failed completely in Europe.
Yes, failed completely.
Yeah, because he was standing alone, especially because Germany at the time, with Merkel leading a great coalition with the Social Democrats, it was a really very stagnant government, didn't want anything. So he didn't really accomplish anything. But now, over the last few years, you see that Europe more or less has come towards France. Is coming his way, I think. If you look at security, but also technology, the raw materials, all this health, there's a feeling that it's part because of COVID, partly because of Russia, that really Europe should stick more together, should be more autonomous and take care of itself, because the pandemic has shown how vulnerable we can be if supply chains are how to say that, if they are broken. And of course, Russia has shown all vulnerability also.
And if we go back to the survey, what were other striking results? Because I also saw a slide about a French connection to Russia and China, which was quite interesting.
Maybe just to react quickly to what Peter said, it's almost like he's read the study, because if we could show the slide about where Europe is needed, we asked a question on which different files people felt that they were best dealt with at European or national level, or whether neither level could cope with them. Interestingly, it was exactly as you say, that when it came to security, when it came to preparing for the next pandemic, this was the largest answer, looking in a pan-European sense, was that this should be handled at European level. But on dealing with rising cost of living, that was seen as something that should definitely stay with national level governments. But yes, the question that you're referring to, we did this survey in part to understand what the expectations were of French leadership within Europe. And being a foreign policy think tank, we went into it with an assumption that there would be a certain level of resentment of French activism, a certain level of distrust that what France was essentially doing was defending the French interest rather than the European interest on different files. But quite strikingly, what you can see from the overall data set is a sense that Europeans are expecting France's power to rise within the European context. They've seen that happening under the course of Macron. They're expecting that to continue, I guess, especially now that there's a pro-European government in Berlin as well, that gives him an ally in that project. But that they're broadly comfortable with that. You get a sense, we asked specifically whether they felt France was a partner that they could rely on, and majorities felt that they were. But when we dug down into which areas they trusted French leadership to protect the European interest, the top three answers were about protecting democracy and human rights in the world, which I thought was quite interesting. But the second biggest one was on the security file, that they see France as a security leader, and that chimes with an interest in Europe investing more in defence cooperation. But then they also seem to trust France on relations with the US, and so here that I thought was quite interesting from your comments in the video earlier on, that AUKUS has been bad for France. That what we seem to see here is that the diplomatic energy that has been invested in the transatlantic relationship since AUKUS seems to have had a bearing on the way people are thinking about French leadership. And I guess the level of communication in the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine may have had a bearing too. But nobody trusts France to defend Europe's interests when it comes to Russia or China. They don't feel that that we have the European interest at heart there.
Why not, do you think, Laurent?
It's a long history. It's a long tradition. Also, for China, I don't know actually, but for Russia, it's a complicated story because they happen to be our allies a few times, but also they invaded us. It's like love-hate relationship. But since France seems to hate America even more than the Russians, it feels like the Russians are our friends again, but not anymore. It changed suddenly. It's very complicated. And the Chinese, I have no idea. I think France is very arrogant, and they think China is a huge country, so are we. So let's talk together. Isn't he? I don't see any other explanation.
And do the results surprise you, like of the survey?
Yeah, that they trust France for democracy. It's a shock. It's never been really a democracy. So yeah, it's been almost a democracy, but it's not Northern Europe. Definitely.
France is not a democracy.
Yeah, it is a democracy, but it's not like it's definitely not like Holland. It's definitely not that Denmark, Sweden of this country, where separation between powers is mild, to say the least. We're not Hungary, but we're not very far. And yeah, the French police like to break the face of people who demonstrate, which is one of the freedoms you should have. So, and we know our political system is definitely not the Dutch political system.
Is this also, just sorry to interject, but on foreign policy as well, I think it is quite interesting that you get this reaction, because France is not one of the member states that I think has been very noticeable in challenging backsliding on the rule of law in Poland or Hungary. You know, this is not a narrative that Macron has invested much in.
And Peter, do you agree with this idea of France being, okay, not like Hungary, but maybe coming close to?
I would say that the comparison with Hungary is a bit exaggerated, but it's certainly it's a quite an authoritarian country with
on which points?
For instance, that Macron, or the president, is perhaps the leader in the Western world with most power.
People also
all power is concentrated at the top. You have, like Macron, at 24% in the first round in 2017. So it's actually a minority of the French people voting for him. And then through the electoral system, he goes up and becomes a kind of king, which he really wants to be. He said he wants to rule like Jupiter.
And if I could add something from the sidelines, I'm still here.
You were. I was like, who is talking?
An additional voice.
Please, Hugo. Yes.
No, and I think that if you look at some of the powers that the French government has, there's the Article 49.3, which basically allows the French government to pass almost any law without a vote once every 6 months. But there are these powers that would seem unthinkable in other democracies in Europe, which sort of raise questions. But Hungary, again, I also think is a quite far comparison.
Well, okay, we don't have the
Laurent,
time,
you're exaggerating a bit. That's what I'm hearing.
Of course, I'm pushing a bit, but
yes.
If you look at the fact that there's literally no counterpower in the parliament, and that the traditional counterpowers have really weakened.
But that might
not
change
Hungary, now. But we're heading towards.
But that might change after the parliamentary elections of this summer.
So, yeah.
And also, you have there is a threshold, so it's also hard to to get a diverse panel of parties. Running in the elections.
Very shortly, so people who are not French will understand. France has always been on the verge of either fascist revolution, either extreme left revolution. So it's always been lots of crises, and one of the way to fix this with this system with two turn of votes. And the idea is that extreme left and extreme right cannot unify for the second run. So whoever is elected, whether it's left or right, is almost never a fascist or communist. So this is also, is from 62, is the war on Algeria. Huh? It was this or a fascist regime of communist dictatorship. So we still have this system that makes us the one who manages to be in the center and who happens to fight against extreme right or extreme left, which is exactly what Macron has been orchestrating, wins almost automatically because no one wants a fascist. We've seen Marine Le Pen, she's a fascist bully. So the system makes that the centrist gets elected. But that means also that 2/3 or most of the electors get systematically ignored. And that's really a problem in a democracy where you don't listen to 2/3 of the, he said, how many, 20%, 70%? It's really embarrassing.
And that's also what we hear in the audience, that people don't vote with their heart, but with their head, strategically, in the second round at least.
Also in the first round, because you need to have the right candidate that's selected. And now the left is, are we going to vote for Mélenchon, who's not really sexy, but his program is the only left wing, or other like really crazy candidates that are funky? It's funny, but then we have Marine Le Pen. Do we want Marine Le Pen again in the second round? Nobody. I don't. Definitely not. It's really.
But you said the system was created to avoid the radicals at both spectrums. But then, so 5 years ago, Marine Le Pen, she came into the second round.
She was not elected.
Okay, but she made it.
Yeah, but few people voted for her actually.
Yeah.
But interestingly, if the system is set up to sort of avoid radicals getting through, I think with this election, she's sounding quite reasonable. She doesn't sound like a fascist.
Because there's Zemmour, because we have another candidate that's so fascist.
But then, essentially that's maybe the system problem, that she's getting further because...
Alors, I don't know for the people who are not French if you heard about Zemmour.
Let's see can we have the picture of the candidates
Zemmour
again?
is a Jewish guy from Algeria with an Arabic name, and he says the Arabs had to go back to Algeria, and he says the anti-Semitic people during the war in France have saved the Jews, which is so not true, by the way. So it's actually anti-Semitic, anti-Arabic candidate. Of course, he's a tiny man. He says men are superior. It's really embarrassing. Women are worth nothing. It's really on all levels. It's so extremely hardcore, hating everyone. And there's still 15% of the French who will vote for him.
It's really crazy because he said somewhere the day that Dominique Strauss-Kahn was arrested was the day that the French man was castrated. Because from now on, seduction is seen as violence.
Yeah. Okay, that's
a real man.
Controversial.
He hunts for women, and sees women as his kind of booty. Yeah. So.
And we see the candidates because, of course, Zemmour he wants to win from Le Pen, I guess. So that's why he's making these controversial.
No, he was doing this long ago already.
Oh, okay, already. He was always controversial.
For years, he's been really but he's really been an asshole, especially towards women. Really insane. And there are now cases that he might have raped assistants, and he says assistants are for blowjobs and coffee. It just says it literally.
But at the same time, he's not doing that bad in the polls.
No, that means really we have like 13% of people who don't mind racism and sexism.
Maybe he's gone down quite a lot, and I think this has to do with his attitude towards women, because women are half of the electorate. So
and that he got paid by Russia. It's obvious he got paid by Russia, and now Russia is not our best friend anymore, so it's a bit embarrassing. Yeah.
Let's go to the upcoming elections in April. We see the different candidates, 12, and the ones who are doing it the best in the polls are above. We see, we already talked about Eric Zemmour, and then we have Valérie Pécresse. She's more conservative. What can we say about her, Susie?
I mean, I think there was a long period over the last month where basically you had Pécresse, Zemmour, and Le Pen all around the same point in the polls, and then Mélenchon behind. But what we've seen over the last week is that Le Pen has pulled away from that pack, and Mélenchon has jumped over them. So I think that it seems quite unlikely to me now that we will see a second round with Pécresse involved. She's also had COVID over the last week, so hasn't been very sort of present and hasn't made sort of much of an impact really with her campaign. So she's, I don't know what others think, but to me she hasn't been a sort of a particularly vivid candidate. She's hardly sort of been there in the discussions.
And then we have the only left winger Mélenchon, and we already talked about Zemmour, Le Pen. Are they a serious threat for Macron?
I think Le Pen is.
If you look at the polls, it doesn't it's like okay.
No, but I saw latest poll. It's only one poll, of course, but anyway, it was in the second round. Macron was projected for 53%, and Le Pen for 47%. So that's a very narrow margin, and anything might happen. So I really thought that it was decided long ago, and when the war in Ukraine started, I thought it would only be to the benefit of Macron, so that would be even more decided. But now, over the last a few weeks and days, you have the McKinsey scandal, which is very damaging for Macron, I think, because whatever is true and not true, it reinforces his image as a man of the elite, president of the rich, man of capitalism.
I was just going to say, and I think this is where the kind of the risk of abstention really does come into play, and the fact that we haven't had a debate and people are feeling sort of quite switched off by this election. That if people don't feel that the second round is kind of worth coming out for, I think that's where that sort of close polling starts to become really worrying.
And I read that Marine Le Pen and Macron refused to debate each other and others. Why is that?
Well, Macron has refused to participate in any debates. He feels it's unpresidential at a time when France is all but at war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But does he also refuse to debate for the second round?
I've heard it's up to April the 10th for definite, but I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. Which is the first round, sorry.
What is interesting is really not that Mélenchon is my favorite, but we have Marine Le Pen, she's not a fascist, she's just extreme right racist, but now it's proven that she's been paid by the Kremlin. For example, when Russia attacked the Crimea, do you say that in English, the Crimea?
Crimea.
Crimea is Crimea in French. Yeah. Crimea. One day later, she said, yeah, it's been always Russian. And poof, she got 8 million from the Kremlin. Because we know now that she's really paid by the Kremlin. Zemmour is paid by the Kremlin. And now we know that Macron is paid by these American consulting firms. So suddenly Mélenchon, who was seen as like this left-wing extremist, seems to be the only one who's not corrupt. So it's a bit more that, not that he's good, but the rest is really, really embarrassing.
And talking about this...
Here I have to interject to say that Mélenchon also has some weird associations with also Putin, with also...
Yeah, but he's not paid by Putin. Mélenchon has this traditional left-wing thing that Russia is our friend. Okay, I don't know if he's really our friend, but at least he was not paid by them.
There's no money scandal.
Yeah, there's really a big difference.
Are you so sure that Macron was paid by McKinsey? Because that's...
it's more than Macron got by McKinsey. What comes out is that when he was working at the bank, he was getting officially only 10%, and 90% was into Jersey or Guernsey. That's a tradition. And so we know that Macron avoided taxes and got paid enormously amount of money. So this also, he asks that everyone pays their share and poor people should pay their share with the Gilets jaunes. And we know that he got millions stashed away in a secret. That's really embarrassing.
I want to go to the invasion, the Russian invasion, because it also meant that certain candidates had to soften their tone, actually, on the topic. Like you said, Marine Le Pen, who got paid by the Kremlin. But what happened after the invasion? How did she change her tone of voice?
I don't know, actually.
Well, there was actually a kind of minor scandal because on her election pamphlet there was a photo of a picture of Marine Le Pen with Putin.
Oops.
And it was... It read a woman of international stature. So it was a bit embarrassing. So the pamphlet was retracted, but you can see it on the site still. But even last week, she initially she refused to attend the speech of Zelensky to the Assemblée Nationale, because she said, "Well, I don't admire Zelensky particularly, and I have other things to do." So then the kind of scandal broke out and a lot of things. And then she said, okay, well, I'll come anyway. But that was quite weak.
And also, I think, on the European projects, she softened a bit because she was like pro Frexit, but now she's not...
In 2017, she said, we want to leave the euro. And I want to have a referendum, kind of Brexit referendum. And I noticed at the time myself that it was not a really popular subject with her supporters.
So she softens her tone?
Now she wants to stay in Europe and just... But she says, like Poland, French law should be superior to European law. Mm-hmm. So I think if she will be elected, Europe will come to a standstill.
I think another sort of shift that we've seen from her was immediately ahead of the Russian invasion. You had a number of the candidates debating whether or not we should pull out of NATO, and that's one where she's dramatically shifted her position. And I think what she's trying to do is appear sort of serious and credible on the foreign policy files in this election campaign. And in the first non-televised debate, she was the one candidate that was sort of choosing not to pick holes in Macron and sort of arguing for the rally around the flag approach, saying that this is a serious situation and we need to take it seriously. So I think she's kind of moving away from any kind of extreme positions when it comes to the foreign and just trying to sort of play it straight down the line.
Zemmour keeps throwing mud, but she softens her tone, actually, which might be working.
And perhaps in the end she has had a lot of advantage from Zemmour. At first it looked like Zemmour was going to draw a lot of voters away from her, but now it seems almost as if she's quite reasonable. Because people have heard some words.
It's a bit like Geert Wilders' PVV that was super radical, and in between, since we have Thierry Baudet, it looks like reasonable, but it's still racist and stuff, but like it's less, so it's the same here. Marine Le Pen is still a racist and almost fascist, but she's less racist and less a fascist than Zemmour, so it's okay.
Okay, but still, there are a lot of people in France who, for several reasons, vote for her.
Yeah.
Actually, when I was in Paris 5 years ago, there was really common wisdom that Marine Le Pen can never be president. And then still she had 33% in the second round, which was quite a lot. But I thought then, at the time, she performed very badly, especially in the television debate before the second round. So I really thought she was finished, because I thought French people like their politicians to have a certain stature, to be presidential, and she was really so weak and so vulgar. So, but now, if you see where we are now, she's the most conservative estimates are 44% or so, something like that.
And what will happen to her voters when Macron wins? And I mean, what happens to those people? Like how
well, I think it's going to be very difficult for him. Of course, they can take to the streets again, like the Gilets jaunes have done. And there's also
the yellow vests,
the parliamentary elections this summer, which were won by Macron 5 years ago, also because of kind of a wave of enthusiasm for a new young candidate. That has worn off, of course. So I think that now, I don't know, but I can imagine you get a very fragmented parliament, which is much more difficult for him to govern.
And you mentioned the left in the beginning. If we look at the polls, it seems like the left has vanished a bit.
Yeah, but it's everywhere in Europe, isn't it?
Okay, but that's not my question. Why? Where's the left in France?
Okay, there's two things. First is the electoral system, the French electoral system. It makes that either you survive or either you win, either you don't, and they don't. So it's very clear. And the second thing is we have a structural problem with the left that is not only French, it's Dutch, it's Belgium, it's English, it's German. The traditional left has almost disappeared. So now we see PVDA is back a bit in Amsterdam. We see Mélenchon is a bit back, so maybe they're coming back. But there's a huge crisis. It's nice too long to talk about it, but more or less they got poisoned. That's my analysis. Okay, I'm not neutral. They got poisoned with right-wing ideas, and Gramsci says the one who imposed its ideas has won, and the right-wing has imposed all the idea of neoliberalism. So of course, left-wing has lost because it's not their ideas. But one thing that I wanted to say, and maybe Dutch people are not aware of it. French people are very, very mixed. Everyone has Algerians or Africans or Portuguese in their family. I mean, everyone. And when you look at them, they still vote for Le Pen or Zemmour, and you say, but your wife is black. Yeah, but that's not the same. Is this really? No. And your father is actually from Algeria. Yes, but that's not the same. It's really fascinating to see how French people manage to be politically so racist, and actually they marry with the foreigners, they make children together, and when you go in the metro, you see everyone is mixed. We all mix, it's definitely clear. But still, there's still 30% of us who are racist, and I find this quite fascinating. I don't know any people who are that mixed and that racist. I still haven't found the explanation.
But isn't it that they're just disappointed in the formal social leftist leaders?
No, they're really being racist. They say horrible stuff about the Arabs, as we call them, not necessarily Arabs, or the blacks or everything. And it's really racist all the time, expressions. As a kid, I say, we don't eat like Arabs, we don't sit like Arabs, we don't do this like Arabs. It's racist all the way. When I was playing techno, I'm a child from techno, my father was saying his nigger music. He was married to an African woman. I mean, it's so you see this racism is everywhere in French society, and at the same time, I think we're ready to be a post-racist society. I mean, sociologically we are, but politically we're still in the 50s. It's fascinating. I don't have an explanation. I just don't understand. But it's really fascinating, the difference between French population that is so mixed, and this politics you've seen, where you have 3 right-wing candidates that ask that anyone who's not ethnically French, that doesn't exist by the way, should go back to their country even after 4 generations.
So you don't say, because there's also people who say we actually have a lot of leftist people, but they just don't turn out, they just don't vote.
Yes, because if you have to choose between right-wing candidate and extreme right-wing candidate, for whom should you vote? Okay, I'm going to do. My mom is a teacher. She's left-wing, like all teachers, and she's always been voting. Every time she makes picture with her voting card, she has stamps and stuff. She's really the good citizen. It's the first time she says the second turn. If it's Le Pen and Macron, maybe for the first time in my life, she's 80, I'm not going to vote. It's really dramatic. If my mom decides not to vote, that means that half of the French decide not to vote.
But I think it's a great shame that in this context, the left, the parties on the left, couldn't come up with a common candidate. I mean, if this current environment can't force that sort of unity among the left, then I don't really see what does.
Yeah, but at the same time, right-wing has managed also. There are 5 candidates, but they win.
Yeah, but they're all going through, yeah.
I want to go to Eliane and then to the audience to see if there are already some questions. Can we see Eliane's cartoon on the big screen? Yeah. And what do we see?
I hope you can see Marine Le Pen, but I just tried another one and it didn't work out. I'm doing my best now, and I'm going to prove that Le Pen is not racist, because there's a little man here and he's not French, but you will see who it is.
You want to prove she's not racist?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but you still have to finish the drawing.
Yes.
Okay, then we'll come back to you then. Okay. Are there any questions? Like, I have a lot of questions, but are there any questions from the audience to our speakers about the elections, or maybe a comment about what you heard? Yes.
On the failure of the left to get together, there was les primaires populaires. Yeah, what's your take on how that failed and the underlying reason? You probably have to explain to the others, but...
To who are you asking the question?
Well, whoever feels best fit, because
who feels fit?
Who feels fit to...
Laurent?
Really? Okay. It's when you have the biggest candidate that's not going to participate, you really have a problem. And it looks like it got kind of manipulated that... well, you don't see, but one of the candidates is famous because she's a woman, she's black, and she managed to get together that France votes for marriage for everyone, so the gay marriage, but for everyone. So she's kind of a left-wing hero. But it turns out that she was here a bit as a submarine to sabotage the candidature of von Mélenchon. And in between, she turned out to be not very well prepared. Everything was very amateur. It was very embarrassing, actually. Did you notice? It was like, oh, no, they didn't prepare, and there was debates, and you see that they had no clue. It was really embarrassing, yeah. Actually, to some point, I stopped watching because I was really embarrassed for them. But I don't know if you have the same.
I think also I live in La France Profonde in Corrèze, which most French people don't even know where that is. And Valérie Pécresse, who claims to be from there, doesn't know where it is. But what I see there is that at a local level, French parties are still quite tribal. So I think that, you don't really identify with the left in that way. You identify either as being La France Insoumise de Mélenchon, or that you're with the Socialist Party. And I think that also played a role, that this idea of joining forces is not very French.
Yeah. Sounds like how we lost against the Romans, huh?
Is there another question from the audience? No, you did not miss anything up to now. Yes, in the front.
Yeah, no, I'm just genuinely a little bit naive on this, but what do you guys actually think are the implications for the EU following this election? I just haven't really heard that much concrete things on that, so anyone willing to talk about that, I'd be interested in it.
Yeah, I'm willing to talk about that. I think the stakes are quite high. So I think in all likelihood we will end up with Macron coming back as president, but he won't be a president sort of tasked with taking the European project further. And, you know, I think that there was a sort of a window of opening with a pro-European government in Berlin, with Macron sort of really driving the whole European sovereignty agenda. And I think that if there has been sort of one positive effect in Europe of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's this kind of this sense that we do rely on each other. We do need to cooperate more closely at European level in a dangerous world of continent-sized powers. And so I think that in order to sort of to work with that moment, we're going to need European leadership that sort of takes us through an extremely tough socio-economic moment. And Hugo, you said you wanted to talk about the energy transition. I think that this is going to be really, really tough over the coming months and years for us to sort of to justify the kind of collective action that we're currently taking against Russia at a European level, and for national governments to sort of hold strong on the worth of doing this jointly and not just kind of simply end up pushing the blame back to Brussels. So I think what worries me is that Macron is not going to have the sort of the political space to play that kind of leadership role and invest as much energy as he has in the first 5 years in the European project. I think he's going to have to be quite domestically focused. You know, if we do end up with the National Assembly being more divided this time around, I think one of the striking things for me, living in France, but sort of spending a fair amount of time in other European countries, is the extent to which the sort of the energy price hikes haven't yet hit in France because because electricity prices have been capped until after the election. So although there is outcry at the moment about fuel prices, it's not the same debate as you're having in other countries in Europe. But that's all going to come in the next few months, and I think that's going to be really tough.
I think if you look at it from a European perspective, of course it matters who is in charge in France, and if Macron will win, there's at least a chance that Europe will go on, and indeed with less political space, perhaps more domestic sorrows for Macron. But if Le Pen wins, that would really mean stagnation in Europe. But you not only have to, the French side of it, but also just general circumstances. And if pressure on Europe increases, I think there will be more European cooperation, even with Macron's troubles.
And Peter, you lived in France, you spoke to a lot of people. I guess, what do you think is the most important theme for people when going to the ballot box? If you would name a top three.
A top three, yeah. But it used to be French identity and immigration.
It's not anymore.
Oh yeah, it is. Huh?
It still is, but it's less salient than before. And then you have, of course, the war in Ukraine, but it's perhaps not really electoral theme. And of course, the pouvoir d'achat, the purchasing power. I think that's very important. That was also the background of the whole Gilets jaunes revolt. And now, over the last few months, life has become much more expensive. So I think that worries people a lot.
And if you look at this last theme, is Macron doing good at this one?
I think no, he's responsible. At least, perhaps he can do how do you say that? It's not his fault, but he's responsible for a society in which life is getting more expensive. So he will be blamed for that. Yeah. And so there will be an
enormous
benefit of Le Pen.
Huh?
Enormous inequality.
We have a few billionaires who own half of the country. It's really they've become so rich during the pandemics, while French people collectively have become poor. Yeah.
I see a cartoon being some kind of ready. Maybe we can see it on the big screen. I am not racist. I have a Russian friend.
That's good.
Yes, any comments on this one?
Very clever.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, there in the back.
Yes, hi, thank you. My question is actually also on the European dimension. And it's more on, if you look back to 2017, I think Macron gave his Sorbonne speech. And if you look at 2020, 2021, all of his talk about strategic autonomy, geopolitical Europe, all of these concepts are now high on the agenda. The whole European agenda is basically shaped by Macron. So my question is, what can, now the current Dutch government in its coalition accord says it wants to be a leading role in Europe. What can the current government, and Rutte in particular, who has said that if you have vision, you should go to the doctor, what can he learn from Macron on that front?
Rutte has changed a lot in that respect. You know, the allies of the Dutch in Europe were always the UK, were very much pro-market, and there was enormous distrust towards France and this dirigiste politics. And so they were always trying to keep France at a distance. But I think the Dutch government has changed, and because of all these changes in the world, more pressure on Europe strategically, I think now the Netherlands sees the relevance of you know, Macron's points of the Sorbonne speech, strategic autonomy.
Someone else who wants to? We're not into Dutch.
No, I mean I agree. I agree with I agree with the analysis. I think the problem is that other Europeans see the extent to which France has influenced the agenda, but French people don't. And or, you know, either don't see it or don't sort of buy that that's a kind of a personal success for Macron. I don't think he kind of scores any points in the French domestic setting for having achieved that debate change. But you know, on the other hand, I do feel that Russia's invasion has changed a lot of things, and what I see in the work that we're doing with the pan-European polling is a sense in which the sort of the European level is where people are placing their hope. So, you know, just I don't mean that in a kind of an ideological sense, but just more in a sort of basic security. This is what we need to do to get through this period sense. And so I think that will probably have a bearing on France's relationship with the European project too.
I'm more critical. I think it's a bit, France is a bit the Russia of Western Europe. We invited everyone, more or less. And everyone, look at, if you have conversation with Dutch people, they have post-traumatic stress about Napoleon, rightfully, I should say. But of course they don't trust France, because even France grew itself by colonizing all the regions around it, and has a tendency of colonizing other people, like Russia is colonizing. And of course we trust France as in they have good ideas, they have a good elite, and they have a point. But as soon as France becomes a bit powerful, the neighbors are uncomfortable, and I think they should be uncomfortable. And that's the problem, is on one side, France should be a leader because it has good ideas. On the other side, all the neighbors don't trust it, and I think they're right to not trust France. It's a bit negative, but if you look at recent issues, no? Okay, we're not as horrible as the Russians, it's true, but... Yeah.
Not yet. Okay, are there any other questions?
Not anymore.
Yes, two, both sides.
Thank you. If Macron gets re-elected, will he be able to raise the retirement age in France? And why are the France so united against a higher retirement age when their age is so much below the European average?
I have the answer.
Okay.
Okay. France has a retraite par répartition. That means that actually you pay now when you're working for people who are retired. And most of retirement, that means there's almost no reserve. The only reserve we have is we need to have sex regularly to make new French people who will pay for retirement. This is really how it works. So on one side, it pushes the French state to make sure that people make enough babies. And in theory, that actually we should invest in their education so that we can have retirement. And there's a system that is independent from the state, that is the caisse de réserve, where the reserve of cash are. And actually, the cash of reserve are good enough, but it's billions. And who wants to get billions? Everyone. So it's always been the game with most of French government trying to get as much money as they can from the, because it's money, I mean, well, France is always short on cash. This is monstrous amount of cash that technically should not be touched. The point is, when you raise this, that means you make more cash available, that goes to the government. Most of the budget problem of the French Republic now could be more or less solved if they manage to make people work 10 years extra. But actually, if you look at the figure in the system, people don't need to work extra. It's the only way is if you want to pay the debt and help the French Republic, then you have to get the retirement. So, of course, many countries consider it the same. It's two different budgets. So actually people are paying for their retirement, but the government would like very much to get into it. That's the real problem. So, of course, people don't want to work more, but if there's no reason to work more, why should you work more? The only reason is that right-wing party says it needs to be reformed because there's all these billions they would love to get into their budget.
And on your left, another question?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question for Susie on how Macron isn't really able to sell his European views in his own country. Do you think it's maybe because he lost connection with his own people, or did he simply never really had it?
I mean, I think that both of those things are true. I think when he started out, he claimed that was something he was going to build, and he never, I think if anything, he seems more distant from most people's reality now than he did 5 years ago, after being in government, and so but as to whether that's why he can't sort of sell the European project to the French people, I think that's more complicated than Macron's relationship with the French people. The French have a sort of a very particular type of Euroscepticism, and it's been one of the countries where through the last 10 years it's been rising most steeply, and this was the case even before Macron. So I think that plays into it as well. But I think that there's also France is one of the countries where we ask this question in our surveys annually about whether or not people think the national system works or it's broken, and France is always one of the countries where that comes out top as well. So I think there's a strong degree of scepticism about sort of authority and government of any type, which also sort of plays into their feelings about the European project. But as I say, I don't think that French people really see Europe as very visible in responding to the things that they're concerned about. We've talked a lot about the cost of living, and I think for me, that's probably the most present issue in this election debate. That's not something that Europe has a particular role on. So there's a sense of, yes, on the broader security context, of course we need to be part of Europe, but that's not the main issue here. And so I think that there isn't that much kind of space for Macron to get the message through. I don't know what others think about that. But
Well, she asked the question. I have a question before we close off to all three of you. If we're looking at the first round of elections, 10th of April, and the second one, 24th of April, where do you hope for? Think big.
In terms of outcomes?
Yes.
I mean, I think the most exciting outcome And the best outcome for sort of French democracy would be that Mélenchon pushed through, and you have a genuine race between Macron and Mélenchon in the first round. I think that's where things would actually get interesting, because I don't think that Macron's sort of argument to be neither left or right holds anymore. I think he is seen as a centre-right candidate. As to whether that's possible, I'm thinking really big there.
Nice fantasy, no? Peter?
Well, I hope. Well, if I look at all candidates, I'm actually most with Macron. And I think it's very important that the extreme right won't win. And it's, like I've said, it's actually quite worrying because France is such a crucial country in this whole European project. And Macron is, of course, very pro-European president, so if he wins, all the pro-Europeans are cheering. But at the same time, if you look at how much votes the anti-Europeans, Le Pen, Zemmour, also to a certain extent Mélenchon are getting, it's getting really very close, and you wonder what will happen next time.
And for you?
I check it more as a politicologist, and it's my job to see how the system works. And the only one who offers a few points that are very important for me, which is the ecology, the energy transition, and a Sixth Republic, because the French Fifth Republic is really in shambles, is Mélenchon. I'm not a big fan of him as a person, but as a leftist, the program is nice. And as I said, the idea that there should be separation of power, that it's over with corruption, that are very important to me. Any democracy should work like that. It's the only candidate who is offering it. But I'm a bit pessimistic when tradition shows that center wins. So I think Macron will win. I'm a bit depressed when I think about it.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to Eliane. I don't think we have time to see how the cartoon will end up, but what is your intention? What do you want to draw? Yes.
Oh, the evening goes so fast.
Yes.
This one will be about that. It's going to say that Macron has a lot of things to do domestically as well, and he's focused on
internationally more, but he should also focus domestically.
So here comes a typical Frenchman who invites Macron into this beautiful Citroën van to go do some domestic work.
Thank you. Keep on drawing, and for the audience, we can see it after the program. I want to wrap up and thank all my speakers, you too, Eliane, and you too, of course, Hugo. And I want to thank the audience. Thanks for watching, and for the audience at home, of course, also, and for the audience here. The conversation doesn't stop here because we have a third round at the bar. So we hope to see you there and hope to see you at home another time. À bientôt.